My grandmother died on a Tuesday in October, and it took my mother 3 days to stop crying long enough to let anyone into her house. I was the one who found the letter. Not because I was looking for anything. I wasn't. I was just trying to clean out the nightstand drawer so we could give the frame to Goodwill, because that's what you do, right? You go through the little things first. The socks, the reading glasses, the half-empty bottle of lavender hand cream that still smelled like her. The drawer stuck a little, the way old furniture does, and when I finally wrestled it open, there was a small brass keyhole box tucked in the back, wrapped in an old scarf like someone had hidden it more than once. I almost didn't open it. I want to be honest about that. Some part of me, the part that had grown up watching my grandmother lock that drawer every single night of my childhood, the part that had asked her 100 times what was inside and always gotten the same soft, tired smile, some part of me knew that whatever was in there wasn't mine to open. But she was gone, and there was no one left to ask permission from. So I opened it. I should back up, because none of this makes sense unless you understand who my grandmother was to me. Her name was Qley, and she practically raised me. My parents worked constantly when I was little. My dad drove long-haul routes, and my mom picked up double shifts at the hospital. So it was Grandma Qley who packed my lunches, who sat with me through every fever, who taught me to read using the backs of cereal boxes because she said, "A book is a book, baby. Don't be a snob about it." She was funny and sharp and stubborn in the way that made you laugh, even when she was scolding you. She had this habit of humming old French songs under her breath while she cooked, even though as far as any of us knew, she'd never set foot outside of Ohio. And every single night, without fail, before she went to bed, she would sit at that nightstand, take out a small brass key from a chain she wore around her neck, unlock that drawer, and just look inside it. For a minute, sometimes longer. Then she'd lock it again and go to sleep. I asked her about it more times than I can count. "What's in there, Grandma?" "Just an old letter, sweetheart." "From who?" "From someone who mattered a long time ago." "Why do you look at it every night?" And she would get this look. Not sad, exactly. More like someone standing at the edge of a memory they didn't want to fall into. And she'd say, "Because some things you're not supposed to forget, even when forgetting would be easier." That was it. That was all I ever got. For 26 years. The letter was old. The paper had gone soft and yellow at the folds, the kind of paper that feels like it might tear if you breathe on it wrong. The ink had faded to a brownish color, but the handwriting was still clear enough to read. I sat down on the edge of her bed, the same bed she died in 3 nights earlier, though the hospice people had already stripped the sheets, and I unfolded it. "Qley, I know you'll hate me for writing this. I know you asked me never to contact you again, and for 11 years I kept that promise, even when it nearly broke me. But I'm not writing to ask for anything. I'm writing because I think you deserve to know the truth before one of us isn't here to tell it anymore. You were right not to trust me back then. I lied to you about where I was those 2 years, and I let you believe things about yourself that weren't true, things that were easier for me to let you believe than to tell you what actually happened. I told you that you weren't enough for me. That wasn't true. I told you I left because I didn't love you the way you loved me. That wasn't true either. I left because I was scared of what loving you meant I would have to give up, and I was too much of a coward to say that out loud. So I said cruel things instead, because cruel things are easier to walk away from than honest ones. I know you built a whole life without me. I know you have a family now, and I am glad, truly, that you found happiness that I wasn't brave enough to give you. But I need you to know one thing before I go quiet again, maybe forever. What happened wasn't your fault. It was never your fault. You spent years believing you weren't worth staying for. You were. I just wasn't the person who deserved to stay. I won't write again unless you want me to. But I needed you to have this, even if it's 20 years too late. I read it twice. Then a third time. My hands were actually shaking a little, which felt strange, like my body understood something before my brain caught up to it. Because here's the thing. My grandfather's name was Walter. He and my grandmother had been married for 51 years. Right up until he passed away when I was 9. Every story I'd ever heard about their relationship, how they met at a church dance, how he proposed with a ring he'd saved 8 months of factory wages for, how they'd never so much as raised their voices at each other in front of the grandkids. None of it made room for a letter like this. None of it made room for someone named H. If you've ever been surprised by what someone really thought of you, subscribe. This story only gets more emotional from here. I didn't tell anyone right away. I want to admit that too, because it wasn't exactly the right thing to do, but I needed to sit with it first. I needed to understand what I was even looking at before I brought it into a house already thick with grief. For 3 days, I carried that letter folded in my jacket pocket like it was something that might catch fire. It was my mother who eventually noticed something was wrong with me. "You've barely said 2 words since the funeral," she said, one evening while we were going through Grandma's closet, pulling out dresses that still smelled faintly of her perfume. "What's going on with you?" I almost lied. I almost said nothing, just tired, just grieving. But my mother has this way of looking at you that makes lying feel like an insult to both of you. So instead I said, "Did Grandma ever tell you about someone named H?" My mother went very still. "Where did you hear that name?" And that's how I learned that my mother already knew something. Not everything, but something. We sat down at the kitchen table, the same table I'd eaten 1,000 childhood dinners at, and I showed her the letter. She read it in silence, her hand pressed flat against her mouth the entire time. And when she finished, she didn't say anything for almost a full minute. "I always knew there was someone before your grandfather," she finally said. "Grandma mentioned it once, years ago, when I was maybe 17. She said there'd been someone she loved very much before Walter, and that it ended badly, and that she didn't like to talk about it. I asked who. She told me it didn't matter anymore. Did you ever ask again?" "Once. She got so upset I never brought it up again." "You didn't push your grandmother on things she'd already closed the door on. You know how she was." I didn't know. Grandma Colette had this way of ending a conversation with her eyes alone. "But this," my mother said, tapping the letter, "this is different than someone before your grandfather. This sounds like..." She stopped herself. "Like what?" I asked. "Like someone she never really stopped loving." That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about all those nights I'd watched her unlock that drawer, all those private minutes I had assumed were about grief for a stranger from her youth, some sweet old sadness she'd folded neatly into the rest of her life. But now I wondered if it had been more complicated than that. I wondered how many nights of her 51-year marriage to my grandfather had included a few private minutes spent with someone else's handwriting. I wondered if my grandfather had known. That question sat in my chest like a stone for the rest of the week. The answer came from an unexpected place. My great-aunt Ruth, my grandmother's younger sister, who was 81 years old and had outlived nearly everyone who might have corroborated her stories, which made her either the most reliable witness left or the least, depending on how charitable you were feeling. I drove 2 hours to see her the following weekend. I brought the letter, though I didn't show it to her right away. I wanted to see what she'd say first, without leading her. "Did Grandma ever mention someone named H?" I asked, once we'd settled into her cluttered little sunroom with cups of tea neither of us drank. Ruth's face did something complicated. Not shock, recognition. "Henry," she said quietly. "Henry Callahan." My chest tightened. Who was he? Colette's first love. Before your grandfather. Before any of us really understood what was happening, if I'm honest. What happened between them? Ruth was quiet for a long moment, turning her teacup slowly on its saucer. "He left her," she said finally. "Just up and disappeared for almost 2 years. No explanation, no goodbye, nothing. Your grandmother was devastated. I mean genuinely, frighteningly devastated. She didn't eat properly for months. Our mother thought she might have to be hospitalized. Did he ever come back?" "He did, actually. About 2 years later. Showed up at her door wanting to explain himself." Ruth's mouth thinned. But by then she'd already met Walter, and Walter was steady and kind, and there. Henry had already proven he wasn't. So she chose Grandpa. She chose stability, Ruth said. "I'm not sure that's quite the same thing as choosing someone, but it was the right choice. Walter loved her every day of his life. I never once doubted that." "Did Grandpa know about Henry?" Ruth hesitated in a way that made my stomach drop. "He knew of him," she said carefully. "I don't think he knew everything." "What does that mean?" Ruth set her teacup down. "It means there's more to this story than I think you're ready to hear all at once, sweetheart. And it's not really mine to tell." I went home more unsettled than before, which I hadn't thought was possible. He knew of him. I don't think he knew everything. What did that mean? What was there to know beyond there was someone before me? Marriages survive that kind of history all the time. People have pasts. That alone wouldn't have justified a locked drawer for 51 years. It was my mother who eventually cracked the rest of it open, and she did it almost by accident. She'd been going through Grandma's old cedar chest, the one at the foot of the bed that none of us had touched in years, looking for a christening gown she remembered from childhood photos. Instead, she found a small stack of photographs bound with a faded ribbon, tucked beneath old quilts. She brought them to me without a word. The photos were of my grandmother, young, maybe 20, standing beside a tall man with dark hair and a crooked, easy smile. In several of them, they were laughing. In one, he had his arms slung casually around her shoulders, and she was looking up at him with an expression I had honestly never seen on my grandmother's face in 26 years of knowing her. Not in any of the photos with my grandfather, not even in their wedding pictures. It was pure, unguarded happiness. But it was the last photograph in the stack that changed everything. It showed my grandmother, visibly pregnant, standing alone in front of a small house I didn't recognize. On the back, in her handwriting, were 3 words. Before I decided. I didn't understand it at first. Neither did my mother. We sat at that kitchen table again, the photographs spread between us like evidence in a case neither of us had wanted to open. Do the math, my mother finally whispered. Grandma married Walter in 1962. If Henry left for 2 years before that. She stopped. I watched her count silently in her head, watched her face change as the numbers landed somewhere she clearly hadn't expected. Mom, I said slowly, when exactly was your older brother born? My mother had an older brother, Uncle Peter. He died of a heart attack 6 years ago, before I was old enough to have really known him as an adult, but I remembered him as a quiet, gentle man who never quite fit the mold of the rest of our loud, boisterous family. I remembered, distantly, some old joke at family dinners about how Uncle Peter didn't take after anybody. My mother's hand was trembling now. 1961, she said, before Grandma and Grandpa ever married. The pieces didn't slam together all at once. They came slowly, painfully, the way truth usually does when you're not ready for it. One small realization opening a door to the next. Uncle Peter wasn't my grandfather's biological son. He was Henry Callahan's. My grandmother had been pregnant when Henry disappeared, and by the time he returned 2 years later wanting to explain himself, she had already married Walter, a man kind enough, it turned out, to raise another man's child as his own without a single complaint, without ever once treating Peter differently from the children that came after. Walter had known. Ruth was right about that. But what he apparently hadn't known, what none of us had known until that letter surfaced, was that Henry had come back. That there had been a version of events where Colette could have told the truth and let her son grow up knowing his real father. And she'd chosen not to. She'd chosen to protect the life she'd built instead. I sat with that for a long time. I thought about every Sunday dinner, every holiday, every ordinary evening where my grandfather had ruffled Uncle Peter's hair exactly the way he ruffled my mother's, where he'd never once, in 51 years, let a single crack show if he'd resented the arrangement. And I thought about my grandmother, locking that drawer every single night, not out of romantic longing the way I'd first assumed, but out of guilt, out of carrying a truth she'd decided nobody else was allowed to touch. We told my mother's siblings together, 2 weeks later, gathered around that same kitchen table. My Uncle Danny, Peter's younger brother, went quiet in a way I'd never seen from him. My Aunt Fran cried almost immediately, though I couldn't tell if it was grief for Peter, who wasn't there to hear any of this, or grief for a mother she suddenly wasn't sure she'd ever fully known. Does this change anything? Danny finally asked, his voice rough. I mean, really, does it change who Peter was to us? Nobody answered right away. It was my mother who spoke first, and her voice, when it came, was steadier than I expected. No, she said. It doesn't change who he was. Dad raised him. Dad loved him exactly the same as the rest of us, every single day, and Peter loved him back the same way. That was real. That never stops being real just because we know more now. Then why does it feel like something's different? Fran asked. My mother thought about that for a long moment. Because we spent our whole lives thinking we knew our mother completely, she said. And we didn't. Not fully. I think that's what actually hurts. Not the facts. The realizing how much of her we never got to see. I went back to Ruth one more time, the letter and photographs in hand, because there was still one piece I needed. Did Henry ever know he had a son? I asked her. Ruth's eyes filled, unexpectedly, and she nodded slowly. He found out, she said, years later. He wrote to her again. Actually, a letter before the one you found, I believe, though I never read it myself. Colette told me once, very late one night when she'd had a little too much wine at Thanksgiving, that Henry had asked if he could meet Peter. Just meet him. Not disrupt anything. Just know him a little. What did she say? She said no. Ruth wiped at her eyes. She told me she was afraid that if Peter ever knew, he'd stop feeling like Walter's son. And Walter had earned that. Truly earned it. She didn't want to take that away from either of them over her own guilt. Do you think she made the right choice? Ruth considered the question with more care than I expected. I think, she said slowly, that your grandmother spent her whole life choosing the option that protected the people she loved, even when it cost her something enormous to carry alone. I don't know if that makes her right, but it makes her human. And it makes the weight she carried every night at that drawer make a lot more sense, doesn't it? It did. The last letter, the one I'd found in the box, the final one Henry ever wrote, arrived. According to the postmark Ruth eventually helped me track down in some old boxes, only 4 years before my grandmother died. Which meant that for the final 4 years of her life, every single night, she hadn't just been remembering an old love. She'd been forgiving herself, over and over, alone, never once asking any of us to help carry it, because she believed, right until the end, that some truths were hers alone to hold. I thought about that the last time I visited her grave, the letter folded carefully back into its envelope and resting in my coat pocket. I didn't decide to burn it, though I considered it. I didn't decide to tell everyone every detail, though eventually most of the family came to know the shape of it, if not every word. What I decided, standing there in the cold October air with my grandmother's name freshly carved into stone, was something quieter than either of those choices. I decided to stop being angry that she'd kept a secret and start being grateful that, in the end, she'd trusted me enough to leave a door unlocked for someone to finally walk through it. Some people carry their truths to the grave. My grandmother carried hers almost all the way there and left just enough light on for one of us to find our way in after her.